Hey horror fam! I create dark, spine-chilling horror stories, and you can help keep the horror alive. Imagine it's like buying me a hauntingly delicious cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, you can donate. My PayPal link is in the description. And with YouTube's guidelines, creating R-rated content is tricky, so if you're up for more unfiltered scares, come join me on Patreon. Thanks for helping me keep the nightmares coming. It was the summer of 2015, and the sun blazed high above Camp Thornwood, nestled deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the sweet notes of freedom as a group of teenagers arrived for their week of sun-soaked adventure. They were an energetic bunch, eager to escape the confines of their mundane lives, unaware that this summer would be different from all the others. Among the campers were 5 inseparable friends: Jenna, the daring leader; Mark, the joker; Lisa, the skeptic; Tom, the follower; and Sarah, the peacemaker. They were notorious for their pranks, always seeking laughter, often at the expense of others. This summer, however, they had set their sights on an unsuspecting target, the camp's caretaker, Mr. Jacobson. Mr. Jacobson was a reclusive man, known for his stern demeanor and his disfigured face, the result of a childhood accident that left him scarred and introverted. He spent most of his time maintaining the grounds, his presence looming over the camp like a dark cloud. The campers viewed him as an easy mark, someone they could use for their amusement. The plan was hatched on a hot afternoon during lunch, the sun pouring through the mess hall windows, casting long shadows across the tables. Mark proposed a cruel prank that involved a fake accident. They would rig an old propane tank near the campfire, making it look like Mr. Jacobson had accidentally caused an explosion. With laughter in their eyes and a touch of malice in their hearts, the friends prepared for their cruel game. That evening, as twilight descended and the campers gathered around the campfire, the air buzzed with excitement. Mark, pretending to be a counselor, summoned Mr. Jacobson to the gathering, claiming they needed his help with a demonstration. The moment he approached, the group activated their scheme. With a loud bang, the propane tank erupted into flames, engulfing Mr. Jacobson in a fiery. Campers screamed, their laughter turning to horror as they witnessed the scene unfold. The flames illuminated the horror on the caretaker's face as he staggered back, hands outstretched, his skin charred and blackened. He fell to the ground, writhing in agony while the campers panicked, unsure of how to react. The laughter faded, replaced by guilt and fear. Jenna led the group away, but deep down, they all knew they had crossed a line. Years passed, but the memory of that night haunted the friends. They went on with their lives, trying to forget the man they had hurt, the man whose life they had ruined. The summer camp was closed the following year after the incident, and it seemed like the past had been buried along with it. Fast forward to 2020. The campers were now young adults, each living their own lives, but the summer nostalgia pulled them back to Camp Thornwood. They decided to reunite and relive the past, unaware that darkness awaited them. The camp had been reopened under new management, a desperate attempt to breathe life into the desolate grounds. Jenna, now an aspiring filmmaker, suggested they document their reunion. "Let's make a movie about our time here. It'll be fun," she declared, igniting excitement among the group. As they arrived at the camp, laughter and nostalgia filled the air, but a sense of foreboding loomed over them, a weight they couldn't shake off. The camp felt different. Eerily quiet, the shadows in the trees deeper, the air heavy with secrets. They settled into their old cabins, reminiscing about the carefree days of their youth, but the past began to rear its ugly head. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, a familiar ritual. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on their faces, igniting laughter and stories. But amidst the merriment, an unsettling feeling crept in. "Do you think Mr. Jacobson is still angry?" Lisa joked nervously, attempting to quickly faded as each friend exchanged uneasy glances. "I mean, we did almost kill him," Tom murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, a chilling breeze swept through the camp, extinguishing the flames. The night plunged into darkness. The friends scrambled for their phones, but there was no signal. Panic set in as they realized they were isolated, cut off from the outside world. Maybe it's just the wind, Jenna suggested, trying to be optimistic. But deep down, a primal fear gnawed at her. They were no longer the carefree teenagers of the past. The weight of their actions had returned, and they could feel it in the air, as they began to talk about heading back to their cabins. A deafening crash echoed through the woods, causing them to jump. Something was out there, watching. They dismissed it as an animal, but the tension remained thick. In the dead of night, the camp was silent except for the distant rustle of leaves. Sarah awoke to a noise outside her cabin, a soft thud followed by a low growl. Heart racing, she crept to the window, peering into the dark woods. Nothing seemed amiss. Just the shadows of trees swaying in the moonlight. She sighed, turning back to her bed, but as she did, a flash of movement caught her eye. A figure darted between the trees, cloaked in darkness, and she felt a chill run down her spine, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. She woke Jenna. "I saw something outside," Sarah whispered urgently. Jenna groaned, rolling over. "You're just imagining things. It's probably just a deer." But the fear in Sarah's eyes made her sit up. "Fine, let's check it out." As they stepped outside, the air felt charged, electric. The friends gathered, each wearing expressions of concern. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice low. "I saw someone out there." "It looked like a person," Sarah replied, glancing into the woods. "Maybe it's just some kids messing around," Lisa suggested. A piercing scream echoed through the night, shattering the silence. The friends froze, eyes wide with terror. The scream came from Tom's cabin. Without thinking, they raced toward the sound. When they burst through the door, they were met with a gruesome sight. Tom lay on the floor, blood pooling around him, his face twisted in agony. A shadowy figure loomed over him, wielding a jagged piece of metal that glistened with blood. "Run!" Jenna screamed, her voice cracking. They stumbled backward, horrified, and sprinted into the night, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding around them. As they fled into the woods, they heard heavy footsteps behind them, a haunting rhythm echoing in the darkness. The disfigured figure was relentless, moving faster than they thought possible. "What do we do?" Mark yelled, glancing over his shoulder. "Split up." Jenna shouted. "We need to find a way out." They scattered into the thick trees, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. Lisa and Sarah ran together, panic driving them forward. The forest felt alive, branches snapping and shadows shifting. "Over here," Lisa shouted, spotting a faint glow in the distance. They sprinted toward it, praying it was a way out. But as they neared, the light flickered and died, leaving them in darkness once more. In the chaos, they lost sight of one another. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their heavy breathing. "Sarah!" Lisa called, but only her echo replied. Suddenly, a chilling laugh echoed through the trees, and the darkness closed in around her. A figure emerged, a tall, heavily scarred man with a twisted grin. It was Mr. Jacobson, the caretaker they had wronged. His eyes burned with fury, a fire that mirrored the pain he had endured. Lisa stumbled back, her heart racing. "No. Please. We didn't mean to hurt you." Mr. Jacobson took a step forward, the light revealing the full extent of his disfigurement. His face was a gray and hollow eyes. "You think you could get away with it?" He growled, his voice a low rumble. "You ruined my life. Now, it's your turn to suffer." Lisa turned to run, but he was too quick. With a swift motion, he lunged, the jagged metal slicing through the air. Lisa screamed as pain shot through her side. She stumbled, falling to the ground. As the darkness closed in around her, she could hear the echoes of her friends' screams in the distance. She was trapped, a victim of her own cruel past. Meanwhile, Jenna and Mark regrouped, breathless and terrified. "We have to find the others," Jenna insisted, glancing back at the shadows closing in around them. They moved cautiously through the woods. The air thick with tension. As they rounded a tree, they stumbled upon the gruesome scene where Tom lay, lifeless. No. No, no. Jenna cried, falling to her knees beside him. The horror of their situation engulfed her. Suddenly, a loud crash resonated behind them. They turned to see Mr. Jacobson emerging from the shadows, eyes filled with rage. "You think you can escape?" Mark pushed Jenna behind him, trying to protect her. "Stay back," he shouted, grabbing a branch from the ground. Mr. Jacobson laughed, the sound echoing in the night. "You think you can stop me? You're all just like the others, nothing but fodder for my revenge." With a swift motion, he lunged at Mark, the jagged metal slashing through the air. Jenna screamed as Mark fell, blood spilling onto the forest floor. Jenna turned to run, but as she did, she stumbled upon Sarah, who was bleeding and in shock. "Jenna, he's coming for us. We need to get out of here." "No. We need to fight back," Jenna declared, her resolve hardening. The two girls backed away, searching for a weapon. They spotted a fallen tree branch, thick and sturdy. Together, they picked it up, standing united against the vengeful figure. As Mr. Jacobson approached, his eyes filled with fury. "Afraid of you." In a sudden flash of realization, the girls recalled something from their childhood, the stories of Mr. Jacobson's past. "You were hurt because of us, but we didn't know. We were just kids." "Kids," he spat, voice filled with venom. "You took everything from me." But in that moment, Jenna saw a flicker of humanity in his eyes. "We were wrong. We can make this right." Suddenly, a glimmer of recognition crossed Mr. Jacobson's face. "You think you can change what happened? You think your apologies matter? We can't change the past, but we can help you find peace." Jenna shouted, her heart racing. As the tension hung in the air, the atmosphere shifted. Mr. Jacobson hesitated, the rage in his eyes flickering. "Please," Sarah urged, stepping forward. "You don't have to do this. Let us help you." For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. But the darkness was powerful, feeding off the pain and hatred that had festered over the years. In a swift motion, Mr. Jacobson lunged at Jenna. With adrenaline coursing through her veins, she swung the branch, connecting with his head. He stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. Taking advantage of his confusion, the girls sprinted into the dense woods, desperate to escape. But the sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, growing closer. They pushed through the underbrush, fear propelling them forward. Jenna's heart raced, but determination fueled her. "We can't let him win," she shouted, glancing back. Suddenly, they broke through the tree line, emerging near the campfire area where their reunion had begun. The flickering flames provided a stark contrast to the darkness they had just fled. "We need to find something to trap him," Jenna declared, scanning the area. They quickly gathered fallen branches and set a barricade near the campfire. As Mr. Jacobson burst into the clearing, his fury renewed. The girls back. Jenna yelled, brandishing the branch like a weapon. With a roar, Mr. Jacobson charged, but the makeshift barrier halted him. Enraged, he slammed against it, sending splinters flying. "Help us!" Jenna shouted, desperate for the others. "We can't do this alone." But as the flames flickered, they realized they were truly alone, their friends lost to the madness. With renewed strength, Jenna and Sarah pushed against the barrier, determined to protect themselves. As the fire blazed, the night erupted into chaos. Mr. Jacobson broke through the barrier, eyes wild with vengeance. The girls fought back, swinging the branch, trying to keep him at bay, in a final act of desperation. Jenna aimed for the propane tank they had once used in their cruel prank. "Now!" she yelled, and they pushed together, aiming for the tank as it ignited in a burst of flames. The explosion sent shockwaves through the camp, engulfing Mr. Jacobson in a fiery inferno. Jenna and Sarah stumbled back, hearts racing as the flames consumed the figure that had haunted their past. The morning light broke through the darkness, illuminating the charred remains of Camp Thornwood. Jenna and Sarah emerged from the woods, exhausted and traumatized. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. Their friends were gone, and the weight of their actions hung heavy on their hearts, as they stood together. The memories of laughter and fun were now overshadowed by the horror they had experienced. The camp would never be the same, and neither would they. With heavy hearts, they made their way home, the memories of that summer forever etched in their minds. The echoes of laughter had turned into whispers of regret, a reminder of the dangers of cruelty and the darkness that lurked in the shadows. In the years to come, the tale of Camp Thornwood would become a ghost story, a warning to those who sought laughter at the expense of others. And the legend of the burned caretaker that some pasts can never be buried. Jenna and Sarah tried to move on, but the horrors of the night clung to them. After the terrifying encounter with Mr. Jacobson, they found themselves haunted by a sense of unfinished business. The forest around them seemed alive, watching, its branches twisting like skeletal fingers in the mist. They were drawn back to Camp Thornwood, though every instinct warned them to leave. As they retraced their steps to the remains of their makeshift barricade, the once familiar surroundings took on a sinister shape. Memories surfaced, of laughter that had now turned hollow and fragmented. Both girls felt as if they were being watched. Every movement weighted with a strange erotic dread, but there was something deeper at play, an insidious energy that lured them deeper into the camp's ruined heart. Jenna was consumed with morbid curiosity, even desire, that she couldn't explain. Her pulse quickened as she felt the pull of the darkness around her, sensing Mr. Jacobson's presence as something that wasn't truly gone. Shadows danced around them, twisting into distorted shapes, making the air thick with dread. The campfire area was colder than the surrounding woods, the flames long gone. But Jenna felt warmth, almost a feverish heat rising from within herself. It was as though the night had taken on a life of its own, feeding off her fear and curiosity. The ghostly silence was broken by whispers, and every word felt like a caress along her skin, stirring forbidden thoughts and awakening her darkest fears. Sarah shivered, casting uneasy glances at Jenna. "Are you okay? You look different." Jenna didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the remnants of the propane tank they had used to fend off Mr. Jacobson. It gleamed in the moonlight, almost beckoning. The night grew heavier as they continued deeper into the abandoned cabins. They could feel the weight of Mr. Jacobson's gaze, his presence both oppressive began to seep into their minds, creating hallucinations of twisted memories, each laced with a disturbing eroticism that felt sickening yet alluring. They could hear his laughter, his voice, luring them, his rage mixed with dark desire. They stumbled upon a hidden basement door they hadn't noticed before, covered by overgrown moss and tangled roots. They hesitated but felt compelled to enter. Inside, it smelled of decay, blood, and sweat, a chilling reminder of Mr. Jacobson's violent presence. The air was thick with memories of torment, each shadow seeming to hold a story of suffering. A collection of crude tools lined the walls, rusted saws, pliers, and jagged knives, each one covered in dried blood. The horror of their discovery intensified, mixing with a twisted fascination that sent a shiver down Jenna's spine. She was gripped by an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch them, to feel the instruments that had once brought agony and pain. Jenna's fingers brushed against a knife, and an overwhelming vision consumed her. She saw herself, bound and vulnerable, her skin bruised and bleeding. The blade traced delicate lines along her skin, sending a sickening thrill through her. She was horrified but couldn't shake the pull of her dark fascination. A voice snapped her back to reality. "Jenna," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jenna turned, and her blood ran cold. Standing in the shadows was Mr. Jacobson, his face twisted in a grotesque expression that was part fury, part desire. His eyes bore into Jenna's with a terrifying intensity, his rage interwoven with something even more disturbing. Before they could react, he lunged at them, his fingers clawing at their clothes, his touch cold and relentless. The air grew thick with the scent of blood and terror as they fought against him, their screams echoing in the confined space of the basement. But their struggle only seemed to feed his sadistic. Jenna felt herself drawn into the depths of his twisted mind, unable to escape the horror he brought upon them. Their screams filled the night as Mr. Jacobson dragged them deeper into the basement, his voice a dark whisper in their ears. "Did you think you could escape me?" he taunted, his voice laced with cruel anticipation. He reveled in their fear, feeding off their terror as he prepared to continue the torment they had so narrowly escaped. Jenna and Sarah were bound, their wrists raw from the ropes that dug into their skin. Mr. Jacobson moved with a sickening confidence, selecting his tools with deliberate care. He ran a knife along Jenna's arm, his touch cold and unfeeling. Savoring the fear in her eyes, Jenna's heart pounded, her mind slipping into a terrifying trance as she felt his touch, the pain mingling with an inexplicable thrill that both horrified and fascinated her. She could feel his twisted desires creeping into her mind, manipulating her thoughts, binding her in ways beyond the physical. With a sudden surge of strength, Jenna broke free from her bonds, lunging at Mr. Jacobson with everything she had. The fight was brutal, each strike filled with the desperate fury of survival. As Jenna and Sarah fought to survive, they found themselves trapped in a place that seemed to twist with their fears. Every step in the camp's ruins brought them deeper into memories they'd tried to forget. The horrific prank that left Mr. Jacobson scarred was everywhere. Each shadow held their past selves laughing, each step felt like a step backward into guilt. Every time they tried to shake it off, but she could almost hear the forest itself whispering, "You deserve this. You're a monster, too." Sarah, meanwhile, was filled with a paranoia so thick it seemed to crawl under her skin. The forest felt alive, hostile. She could feel eyes on her, watching her every move, judging her. The rustling of leaves sounded like accusing whispers, "You're next." Just like him. The intensity of the psychological horror began to manifest through vivid hallucinations that between reality and terror. Jenna saw flickering images of Mr. Jacobson's burned face morphing into her own. Her skin blistered and cracked in her mind's eye, her body transforming into the grotesque image she had inflicted on him years ago. She would stare into a shattered mirror, only to see herself as Mr. Jacobson, twisted and unrecognizable, a ghastly reminder of the pain she'd caused. Sarah wasn't spared. She saw her friends, faces lifeless and contorted with horror, reaching out to her with accusing, pleading eyes. "Why didn't you save us?" they murmured, and their voices echoed in her mind, their words wrapping around her thoughts like a relentless chokehold. She began to doubt her senses, questioning every sound, every shadow. When she looked at Jenna, she didn't see her friend anymore. She saw someone twisted, untrustworthy, perhaps even capable of leading her into further darkness. They tried to escape, yet every path they took seemed to wind back to the campfire area where the nightmare had started. The camp's layout twisted and warped, making escape impossible. The woods themselves seemed to conspire with Mr. Jacobson, closing in on them, trapping them in an endless maze of branches and shadows. Mr. Jacobson's presence was palpable. They would catch glimpses of him in the distance, a flicker of movement, a shadow passing too close, and every time, he seemed closer, more determined, his eyes glowing with a relentless, and the pursuit intensified. He was relentless, wielding a serrated blade with a terrifying precision honed by years of planning. The chase reached fever pitch, with Jenna and Sarah narrowly evading his attacks, their every move driven by sheer survival instinct. The psychological horror ramped up as they became trapped in a clearing surrounded by mirrors Mr. Jacobson had strategically placed, forcing them to see themselves from every angle. Their faces stared back, bloodied and terrified, each reflection twisted in unimaginable ways, each one showing a part of themselves they feared, cowardice, cruelty, guilt, desperation. Mr. Jacobson's voice came from everywhere, taunting them, reminding them of the person they had turned him into. "Look at yourselves. You're as monstrous as me," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "The real horror is in who you are, not in what I've become." Their last desperate bid for freedom led them back to the camp central fire pit, where they had first wronged Mr. Jacobson years before. It was fitting that their confrontation would end here, in the place that had birthed this nightmare. Jenna and Sarah stood side by side, their eyes blazing with a mix of terror and defiance, prepared to confront the horror they had unleashed. Mr. Jacobson's appearance was monstrous. His body was scarred and misshapen, a horrifying testament to the pain they had caused. His eyes were filled with unrelenting rage, yet there was a glimmer of satisfaction, a sense that he had finally cornered his prey, that justice would be served. But as Jenna stared into his eyes, she saw more than rage. She saw a deep, haunting sadness, a lifetime of kindness turned to cruelty, of compassion twisted into vengeance. She realized that he was as much a victim as they were. In a final act of defiance, Jenna stepped forward, holding a flaming torch they had managed to grab. She looked into his eyes, a plea mixed with apology. "We didn't know, we were kids. Cruel, thoughtless kids. But we see you now. We know what we did." For a moment, the night grew silent, as if holding its breath. In the silence, Mr. Jacobson faltered. His anger had driven him for so long, but Jenna's words hit a nerve. A flicker of humanity crossed his face as he grappled with his urge for revenge against the remorse that Jenna's words had awakened. With a scream of rage, he turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving them alive but forever changed, haunted by the scars of that night. They survived, but as they looked at each other, they knew they would never truly be free of the nightmare they had set in motion. The campfire crackled ominously as Jenna and Sarah stood frozen in a clearing. The heavy silence of the forest pressing in around them. The dark trees loomed like watchful sentinels, their branches twisting and writhing as if eager to ensnare them. Shadows danced in the flickering firelight, and the crackling flames felt like a mockery of their situation, a cruel reminder of the warmth that had once surrounded them now twisted into a nightmare. Jenna glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were wide with fear, reflecting the flickering flames. "What if he comes back?" Sarah's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "What if he's just waiting for us to let our guard down?" "We can't stay here," Jenna replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "We have to find a way out. We need to stick together." Yet even as she spoke, her mind raced with doubt. Would they ever truly escape the horror they had unleashed? With every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, their hearts raced, and the air thickened with impending dread. Each second felt like an eternity as they searched for an escape route, only to find themselves drawn back to the very place where their past sins had taken root. As they navigated the dense underbrush, memories of that fateful night clawed at after, the firelight, the innocent joy, how easily it had all turned to ashes. It was as if the forest itself conspired against them, each tree whispering their names, a haunting chorus of judgment. Jenna squeezed her eyes shut, fighting against the creeping guilt that threatened to consume her. Suddenly, the world around them shifted. Shadows began to morph into shapes, faces she recognized but couldn't place, campers from years past, their eyes hollow and accusing, their mouths moving silently, forming words she couldn't hear. Jenna stumbled back, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Sarah! Do you see that?" she cried, pointing at the phantoms emerging from the darkness. But Sarah shook her head, fear etched deep into her features. "It's just your mind playing tricks. We have to keep moving." Yet, deep down, she was terrified that they were being watched by more than just the vengeful caretaker. They pressed on, the darkness swallowing them whole, the oppressive silence broken only by the sounds of their own hurried breaths. As they moved deeper into the woods, Jenna felt an unseen presence trailing them. It was a suffocating feeling, a weight pressing down on her chest, tightening with each step they took. She could almost feel his gaze, cold, calculating, full of wrath. Their frantic escape brought them to the lake, a dark, glistening expanse of water that reflected the moonlight in a chilling, distorted way. The surface rippled with unseen disturbances, casting eerie shapes that sent a shiver down Jenna's spine. She hesitated at the water's edge, the memories of their past still haunting her. "Jenna, we can't stop now," Sarah urged, her voice laced with urgency. "If he finds us here," but Jenna was lost in the reflections. The water shimmered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw Mr. Jacobson standing at the lake's edge, his disfigured face twisting in agony. She blinked, and he was gone, but the vision remained, a ghostly reminder of the torment they had inflicted upon him. "We need to find a way across," Jenna said, her heart racing as she tried to shake off the sight. There has to be a boat or something. As they searched the perimeter of the lake, they stumbled upon a dilapidated boathouse, its wooden frame weathered and decayed. The doors creaked open ominously, revealing an array of half-sunken boats. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mold and rot. Jenna felt a creeping dread as they stepped inside, glancing around nervously. "Look," Sarah pointed, her finger trembling as she gestured toward a small rowboat. "We can take that." "Let's just be quick," Jenna urged, her instincts screaming that they were being watched. As they maneuvered the boat to the water, the moonlight cast a haunting glow, illuminating the surface of the lake as they pushed off. As they paddled away from the shore, the sense of relief was palpable, but it was short-lived. The stillness of the lake was deceptive, an eerie calm that belied the terror lurking beneath. The water sloshed against the boat as they moved further into the darkness, the shadows of the forest closing in around them. "Do you think he'll come after us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Jenna admitted, glancing back toward the shore. "But we can't let him catch us. We have to keep moving." As they drifted into the deeper parts of the lake, the air grew colder, and a fog began to rise, wrapping around them like a living shroud. The atmosphere thickened, and Jenna's heartbeat quickened as she felt a shift in the air. Then, out of nowhere, the peaceful silence shattered, a loud splash erupted from behind them, and Jenna whipped around, her heart pounding. There he was, Mr. Jacobson, emerging from the water, his form grotesquely contorted, eyes wild with rage. He lunged forward, a sharp object glinting in his hand, an old. Jenna screamed, adrenaline surging as they frantically rowed away from the killer. The boat rocked violently, nearly tipping over as Jenna's heart raced. She could feel the weight of his wrath pushing against them, the water around them growing choppy and turbulent. Mr. Jacobson's figure loomed closer, his rage fueling at terrifying speed as he propelled himself through the water, the harpoon slicing through the air toward them. Jenna ducked just in time, feeling the rush of wind as it whizzed past her. The boat rocked dangerously as they fought to maintain their balance, fear overwhelming them. "Go, go, go!" Sarah shouted, her voice raw with panic as they paddled with all their might. But the boat was sluggish, weighed down by the water and their own terror. With a roar of frustration, Mr. Jacobson lunged again, the harpoon plunging into the side of the boat. Wood splintered under the force, and water gushed in. Jenna and Sarah scrambled, desperately trying to keep the vessel afloat, but the killer was relentless. "Hold on!" Jenna yelled, her mind racing. In a split second, she grabbed a broken oar and swung it at Mr. Jacobson as he pulled himself onto the boat, his disfigured face twisted with fury. The oar connected with a sickening thud, staggering him back, but it was only a momentary reprieve. Mr. Jacobson recovered quickly, fury igniting in his eyes. "You think you can escape?" he hissed, venom dripping from his voice. "You will pay for what you've done." The boat was sinking fast, water pooling around their feet. With no choice left, Jenna made a desperate decision. "Jump. We have to swim for it." "Are you crazy?" Sarah protested, but the look in Jenna's eyes brooked no argument. They couldn't stay on the sinking boat, now. Jenna shouted, and they both plunged into the dark, cold water. The shock took their breath away as they swam frantically away from the live, tugging at them, pulling them down into the depths. As they swam, Jenna felt the water brush against her legs, and panic surged through her. What if Mr. Jacobson followed? Glancing back, she saw his figure break through the water, a monstrous silhouette against the moonlight. "You can't run forever," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the lake as Jenna and Sarah fought to stay afloat. With adrenaline coursing through her veins, Jenna pushed through the panic and focused on the shore. "We're almost there," she gasped, urging Sarah on. They swam as hard as they could, but Mr. Jacobson was gaining on them, the rage in his eyes fueling his speed. Jenna's muscles screamed in protest. But she couldn't give in. The shore was within reach, and as they broke the surface and dragged themselves onto the muddy bank, Jenna turned back just in time to see Mr. Jacobson surging toward them. "Get back!" she yelled, scrambling to her feet as they staggered up the bank. The two of them ran, their lungs burning as they sprinted into the woods, the underbrush scratching at their legs. Desperation drove them forward, and after what felt like an eternity of running, they stumbled upon an old cabin, hidden in the shadows. Jenna glanced back, her heart racing. They had to take their chances inside, quick, inside. Jenna urged, and they burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them. They leaned against it, breathless and terrified. The cabin was dark, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the beams of moonlight seeping through the cracks. What now? Sarah gasped, panic overtaking her. Jenna's mind raced as she scanned the room. The walls were lined with rusted tools and hunting trophies, remnants of a time long gone. "We need to find something to defend ourselves," Jenna said, her voice steady despite the fear that through the cabin. They found a hunting rifle leaning against the wall, its barrel cold and unyielding. Jenna grabbed it, checking the chamber, only to discover it was empty. "We need bullets," she exclaimed, panic seeping into her voice. "I'll look in the other room," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling. She hurried to the back of the cabin while Jenna remained at the front, listening intently for any sounds of their pursuer. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed outside, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Jenna's heart raced as she peered through a cracked window. Mr. Jacobson was approaching, his figure cloaked in darkness, wielding the harpoon like a predator savoring the thrill of the hunt. "Sarah!" Jenna called, fear lacing her voice. "We need to move." But before she could finish, the door flew open, and Mr. Jacobson stood there, his face twisted in a horrifying grin. "You thought you could hide?" he taunted, stepping into the cabin, the air thick with tension. Jenna instinctively raised the rifle, but it was too late. Mr. Jacobson lunged at her, and she barely dodged to the side as he crashed into the wall. The impact shook the cabin, and a primal scream erupted from Jenna's throat as she struggled to keep the rifle steady. In that moment of chaos, Sarah rushed back into the room, her eyes wide with horror. "Jenna! Behind you!" With adrenaline pumping through her veins, Jenna swung the rifle and struck Mr. Jacobson across the face. He staggered back, snarling in fury. The rifle was heavy, the grip slick with sweat, but Jenna held on with all her strength. "Get out of here!" Jenna yelled to Sarah, but the words barely escaped her lips before Mr. Jacobson charged again. This time, he tackled Jenna to the ground, pinning her beneath him. His eyes were wild, full of rage and hatred. "I'm going to make you suffer," he hissed, his breath hot against her face. Jenna fought back, clawing at his arms tighter. Dots danced in her vision, but she couldn't give up. Not now. In a desperate bid for survival, Jenna's hand fumbled on the floor until she found a jagged piece of glass from a broken mirror. With a swift movement, she drove it into Mr. Jacobson's side. He howled in pain, releasing her throat as he staggered back, blood pouring from the wound. "Jenna!" Sarah cried, rushing to her side. "We have to go." With a newfound determination, Jenna stumbled to her feet, the pain in her throat igniting a fire within her. They dashed toward the back door, but Mr. Jacobson was already recovering, his eyes filled with a terrifying resolve. "Don't leave me," he roared, his voice echoing through the cabin. And as he lunged again, Jenna and Sarah dashed out into the night. They sprinted into the woods, the darkness swallowing them whole. Twigs snapped underfoot, branches clawed at their skin, but they couldn't slow down. The sounds of Mr. Jacobson's pursuit echoed behind them, a chilling reminder of the monster they were fleeing. As they ran deeper into the woods, Jenna's mind was a whirlpool of memories and emotions. The guilt of that night, of the prank gone wrong, washed over her like a wave. It was more than just survival now, it was about facing the consequences of their actions. "Jenna!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking through the fog of Jenna's thoughts. "We can't keep running. We have to face him." "No," Jenna cried, shaking her head. "We can't." hit the darkness, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they prepared for Mr. Jacobson's inevitable return. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves sending chills down their spines, and then he appeared, stepping into the clearing with an air of predatory grace. His eyes glinted with madness, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. "You think you can escape me?" he taunted, advancing slowly, deliberately. With a surge of courage, Jenna and Sarah stood their ground, the remnants of their broken innocence hanging in the air between them. "Stop!" Jenna shouted, her voice breaking the stillness. "This ends now, Mr. Jacobson. You won't take us." "Take you?" He laughed. A chilling sound that echoed through the trees. "You think I want you? You've already suffered enough, haven't you? You've been haunted by your guilt since that night. I'm just here to make it more interesting." Jenna tightened her grip on the glass shard, her heart pounding in her chest as she took a step forward. "You're not a monster. You're a coward, hiding behind your pain and suffering." His expression twisted with rage, but in that moment of vulnerability, Jenna saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps. Or was it regret? It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the feral glare of the killer who had tormented them for far too long. "Enough!" Mr. Jacobson shouted, lunging at Jenna with the harpoon raised high. In an instant, Jenna reacted, sidestepping him and plunging the shard deep into his shoulder. He roared in pain, staggering back. Sarah seized the moment, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging it with all her strength, knocking the harpoon from his grasp. The battle intensified as Jenna and Sarah fought against the embodiment of their guilt, their every move fueled by the desperate need for survival. They pressed forward, refusing to back down, refusing to let the past define them. Jenna shouted, and with a synchronized thrust, they drove the glass shard deep into Mr. Jacobson's chest. He gasped, his eyes widening in disbelief as he collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him. In that moment, the weight of their actions came crashing down. The fear, the guilt, the pain, they all merged into one overwhelming emotion. Jenna knelt beside him, breathless and shaking. "This is for all the lives you've destroyed," she whispered, her voice trembling as the realization of their freedom washed over her. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, a profound stillness enveloped the clearing. The nightmare was finally over. Mr. Jacobson lay lifeless at their feet. His reign of terror extinguished, Jenna turned to Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she choked out, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and relief. But as the sunlight illuminated the forest, a new realization settled within her, a heavy burden that would never fully lift. The guilt would always remain, a constant reminder of that fateful night, of the choices they had made. They had survived, but at what cost? Hand in hand, they stepped away from the clearing, leaving the horrors of the night behind them. Together, they began their journey toward redemption, knowing that while the past would haunt them, it would not define their future. Days turned into weeks. And though they returned to their lives, the shadows of their experience lingered. Jenna often found herself staring into the dark corners of her room, waiting for the echoes of the past to fade. But each time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the lost, those they had hurt, those they had betrayed. In the quiet moments, she would whisper apologies into the stillness, hoping that somehow, they could hear her. The memories remained vivid, each one a reminder of the fine line between innocence and guilt. Forward, Jenna and Sarah learned to live with their choices, to embrace the light that filtered through the darkness. But they also understood that some shadows never truly disappear, they simply linger, waiting for the right moment to remind them of the price of survival. The forest grew deathly silent as Jenna and Sarah stumbled through the underbrush, their bodies bruised and scraped, with a lingering chill settling over them. Every step they took felt labored, weighed down by exhaustion and a relentless sense of dread. Even with Mr. Jacobson dead, shadows seemed to follow them, dark, oppressive shadows that whispered and taunted, reminding them of everything they couldn't forget. Jenna glanced back toward the clearing, expecting to see his figure rise again, his bloodied harpoon glinting in the dawn's faint light. She shuddered, clutching her arms tighter. But there was nothing. Just trees, dense and foreboding, watching them as they tried to flee. Do you think he's really gone? Sarah's voice was a shaky whisper, barely audible over the pounding of their footsteps. He's dead. We made sure of it, Jenna replied, though doubt gnawed at her, sour and sickening. But what if? She swallowed hard, refusing to voice her fear aloud. She couldn't bear the thought of him lingering, of his ghost haunting the edges of her mind, as the trees thickened around them. The forest took on an eerie silence, amplifying every twig snap, every rustling leaf. Each sound made them jump, expecting Jacobson's brutal laugh or the glint of his bloodied harpoon around every corner. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching and waiting, relishing in their terror. After what felt like hours, Jenna and Sarah found a small stream trickling through the forest. They collapsed by the water's edge, gulping down cold handfuls, letting the icy chill ground them. But even here, their thoughts were plagued by lingering memories. The face of Mr. Jacobson twisted in rage, lines like a ghost that refused to leave. Jenna shut her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. She could still feel his hands around her throat, squeezing, his breath hot and acrid. The feeling was suffocating, pulling her into a dark, claustrophobic spiral. She gasped, her fingers tightening around her throat, as if testing the bruises that were already forming. Jenna? Sarah's voice cut through the fog, snapping her back to the present. Jenna's eyes flew open, her gaze meeting Sarah's. The terror in her friend's eyes mirrored her own. They were both haunted, both scarred, both carrying the burden of survival, and the guilt of what they'd done. She felt a twisted sense of responsibility for their torment. "This is all because of me," Jenna muttered, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked away, her face hardening. "We did what we had to do, Jenna. He was going to kill us. But he's dead now. And I can't stop seeing him, feeling him." Her voice broke, her words trailing off into the emptiness of the forest. "It's like he's still here." The forest seemed to close in around them, as if listening to their every word, each secret and fear seeping into the soil. And as the silence grew thicker, the shadows seemed to shift, taking on twisted, ghostly shapes. Exhaustion tugged at their limbs, but the need to keep moving, to escape the forest and everything it held, drove them forward. Jenna's mind was a whirlwind of memories, guilt and fear, each step they took blending the lines between reality and nightmare. As they trekked deeper into the forest, a chill settled over them, colder than before. They could feel it in their bones, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed unnatural, oppressive. Jenna's skin prickled, a sense of unease crawling up her spine. She glanced at Sarah, who looked just as unnerved. Suddenly, Jenna heard a whisper, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere, and rose, heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's face went pale, her eyes wide with terror. I thought it was just me." The whisper grew louder, a chilling, incomprehensible sound that sent shivers through them. They could hear snatches of words, twisted and warped, like distant voices echoing from another world. Guilt. Punishment. Never. Escape. The words tore through Jenna's mind, each syllable digging into her soul, dragging her back into the memories she had tried so hard to bury. She could see it all, the prank, the accident, the aftermath. And the faces, so many faces, twisted in pain and betrayal, as the whispers grew louder. The forest seemed to come alive. Shadows shifted, stretching and twisting, taking on ghastly forms. Figures appeared among the trees, pale, ghostly apparitions with hollow eyes and accusing stares. Faces from their past, faces she recognized, faces that she had tried to forget. "No, this isn't real," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. But the faces remained, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their mouths open in silent screams. Sarah grabbed her arm, her fingers digging into Jenna's skin. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Jenna couldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the nightmare, unable to look away from the accusing stares. The faces were so close now, their eyes empty. their mouths twisted in eternal agony. She could hear their whispers, feel their cold, bony fingers reaching for her, pulling her down into the darkness. Desperation took hold, and Jenna tore herself away, dragging Sarah with her as they stumbled through the forest. The apparitions followed, their spectral forms gliding through the trees, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Each step they took, the forest seemed to close in, the trees twisting and bending, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to ensnare them. Jenna's breath came in ragged gasps, her vision blurring as panic ghosts pressing down on her, suffocating her, dragging her deeper into her own mind, into the depths of her guilt and fear. Sarah's voice was distant, barely audible over the cacophony of whispers and the relentless pounding of Jenna's heart. "Jenna, please. Don't leave me." But Jenna was slipping, falling into a dark, twisted nightmare from which there was no escape. She could see it all, the blood, the screams, the look of betrayal in the eyes of those they had wronged. It was all coming back, drowning her, consuming her, and then she saw him. Mr. Jacobson stood before her, his body broken and bloodied, his eyes filled with an unnatural, vengeful light. He grinned, a twisted, mocking smile that sent chills down her spine. "You thought you could escape me?" His voice was a low, menacing growl, each word laced with malice. Jenna stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind reeling. "No, you're dead. I killed you." Mr. Jacobson took a step forward, his grin widening, his eyes gleaming with a sadistic delight. "You can't kill what's already dead. I'll always be here, Jenna. In your mind, in your nightmares. I am your guilt, your fear, your punishment." The words echoed in her mind, twisting and distorting, filling her with a sense of hopelessness and dread. She could feel his presence, his cold, clammy hands reaching out to claim her. To drag her down into the darkness. "Leave me alone." Jenna screamed, her voice echoing through the forest, but her words were swallowed by the shadows, lost in the endless void. In her terror, Jenna didn't notice Sarah's silence, her stillness as she stared into the shadows, her face pale and expressionless. It was as if she had given in, accepted her fate, her body numb to the horror that surrounded them. Jenna turned to her, her eyes wide with panic. "Sarah. Please, don't leave me." But Sarah didn't respond. She was staring into the distance, her gaze unfocused, her face as if she were already gone, lost to the darkness, to the guilt that had consumed them. "Sarah." Jenna grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, desperate to break through the numbness. "We need to keep moving. We can't. We can't let him win." Slowly, Sarah's gaze shifted to Jenna, her eyes hollow and empty. "Maybe he's right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe this is our punishment. For everything we've done." Jenna shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, we can't give in. We have to fight. We have to survive." But even as she said the words, she felt the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, pulling her into the depths of despair. She could see the faces of those they had hurt, those who had suffered because of their actions. And she could feel Mr. Jacobson's presence, his mocking laughter echoing in her mind, a constant reminder of her sins as they carried her through the thick undergrowth, each step crunching against fallen leaves and broken branches. She could hear her heartbeat thundering in her ears, louder than the whispers that seemed to permeate the forest. Every shadow seemed to shift, and the trees closed in around her, warping her sense of direction. "We're going in circles," she muttered, her voice shaking as she glanced over her shoulder. Behind her, Sarah was stumbling, her face pale and covered in sweat, her eyes distant and unfocused. Jenna didn't recognize this look in Sarah, a hollow gaze that seemed to signal the gradual unraveling of her mind. Jenna fought the urge to panic. She couldn't let fear consume her now, not when they were this close to escaping. But every step they took, every direction they tried, only seemed to bring them back to the same spot, a small clearing where the ground was covered in what looked like ash. Jenna swallowed hard, her throat dry as she tried to ignore the eerie familiarity of the place. "It's like he's controlling us," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze flickered around the clearing, her hands clenching and unclenching as if she were trying to ground herself in reality. Jenna didn't respond, but deep down, she felt the same. It was as if the forest had come alive, bending to the will of a malevolent force, trapping them in an endless loop. The realization made her stomach churn, a cold dread settling over her as she realized there was no escape. Hours passed, though time felt irrelevant in the oppressive darkness of the forest. Exhaustion tugged at Jenna's limbs, and her mind began to blur the lines between reality and hallucination. She could still hear the whispers, low and insistent, echoing the voices of those she had wronged, each one growing louder and more accusatory, pressing her hands to her ears, but the voices only grew louder, each one a reminder of the past she couldn't escape. They chanted her name, twisted and distorted, filling her mind with a sickening dread, Jenna. The voice was a low, guttural rasp, dripping with malice and resentment. Jenna's eyes flew open, and she stumbled back, her breath hitching as she came face to face with Mr. Jacobson's specter. His face was a twisted mask of scars, his eyes blazing with an unholy light, his grin wide and menacing. "You thought you could escape me?" His voice was a low snarl, each word dripping with venom. "I am your guilt, your fear, your punishment." Jenna's chest tightened, her heart pounding as she tried to look away, but his gaze held her captive, his eyes boring into her soul, stripping away every facade, every defense she had built. She could feel his presence seeping into her mind, invading her thoughts, twisting them into a nightmarish distortion of reality. "No, this isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to shake. The sight of Mr. Jacobson's silhouette in the cabin window was haunting, as if his figure had melded with the shadows. Jenna and Sarah had nowhere else to go. Their bodies ached, minds frayed with fear, yet a strange determination pushed them forward. Inside the cabin, they found an old fireplace, its embers long dead. Dust clung to every surface, and faint scratches marked the walls, like desperate claw marks. The faint smell of burnt flesh lingered in the air, an unsettling reminder of the man they once wronged. Jenna's hands shook as she reached for a rusted lantern, flickering it on to cast dim light around them. "We need to stay calm," she whispered, mostly to herself, trying to ignore the scratching sounds creeping from the dark corners of the room. But Sarah, already frail from the ordeal, was beginning to break down. "He's here, Jenna. I feel it. I can't keep running. He wants us to suffer, and he'll keep coming until we're as broken as he is." Jenna swallowed, feeling her own fear twist into a sickening sense of guilt. She knew Sarah was right. This was a place of suffering, a place meant for reckoning. But she couldn't give in, not yet. As they took refuge in the cabin, the dim light began playing tricks on their minds. Jenna's thoughts became hazy, her memories and current reality merging. She started to see visions of her teenage self, laughing with friends around the campfire, ignorant of the terror they would unleash. But instead of the laughter being joyful, it turned into cackling mockery, echoing in the corners of her mind. "Do you remember that night?" A voice whispered, and Jenna jolted as she turned to see a figure flew to her mouth, her breath catching, as she realized she was staring into her own eyes, her younger, guiltless self. The younger version sneered, taunting, her face gradually transforming into a twisted, scarred reflection of Mr. Jacobson's own burned visage. "This is what you deserve, Jenna," the vision hissed. "You can't hide from the past." Sarah, meanwhile, was cowering in the corner, clutching her arms and muttering incoherently. She was surrounded by hallucinations of her own making, her mind unraveling faster than Jenna's. "Make it stop," she whimpered. "Make it stop, Jenna." Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold draft swept through. In the shadows stood Mr. Jacobson, the burned scars on his face now more terrifyingly raw and grotesque under the dim light. His eyes gleamed with an unholy fire, filled with pain, hatred, and something Jenna couldn't name, perhaps a sick satisfaction in watching their terror. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every moment of their fear. In his hand, he held a sharpened piece of metal, its edge jagged and rusted, clearly crafted for causing pain rather than a swift end. do you think you've suffered enough? He asked, his voice low and guttural, echoing in the small room. Jenna's mind was in turmoil. She struggled to speak, her voice barely a whisper. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Mr. Jacobson's twisted smile showed no forgiveness. Intentions don't matter. Actions do. He took a step closer, and Jenna's heart pounded, trapped between her will to survive and the guilt that had eaten at her for years. With a flick of his wrist, he slashed the rusted metal across Sarah's arm, and she screamed, clutching the bleeding wound. The sight of her friend's pain snapped Jenna out of her trance. She couldn't let him do this. She lunged forward, hoping to knock the weapon from his hand, but he was stronger, unyielding. He shoved her back, sending her sprawling across. What I felt, he murmured, looming over them both. As Jenna lay on the floor, her hand brushed against a shard of broken glass. She gripped it tightly, her resolve hardening as she realized that if she didn't fight now, they would both die here, haunted and tortured by this specter from their past. Let's finish this, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, and she thrust the glass at Mr. Jacobson's leg, slashing deeply. He howled in pain, stumbling back. For a moment, she felt a surge of triumph. But then, as his eyes met hers, she saw a strange glimmer there, a mix of anger and anguish, as if he was reliving the pain of that night all over again. Jenna's confidence wavered as he reached down. His hand finding her wrist with an iron grip. Just as he was about to raise the metal shard for the final blow, Jenna screamed, "It was an accident. We didn't mean for this." Her words seemed to halt him, if only for a moment. His gaze softened, just barely, and in that brief pause, Jenna saw the agony he carried, a deep wound from years of resentment and suffering. He released her wrist, but his voice was hollow. "Then why didn't you come back for me? Why didn't you help?" Jenna felt tears spill down her cheeks as the full weight of her guilt crushed her. She couldn't answer him, because she knew there was no excuse. In their youth, they had left him to suffer, blinded by fear and selfishness. Taking advantage of his momentary lapse, Sarah, with the last of her strength, pushed herself to her feet and grabbed a piece of wood from the broken furniture nearby. With a scream, she swung it with all her might, knocking Mr. Jacobson back. He fell, stunned, the jagged metal slipping from his grasp. Jenna saw her chance. She grabbed Sarah's hand, and together, they bolted out of the cabin, not daring to look back. They didn't stop running until the trees thinned, the faint glimmer of dawn breaking. Exhausted and covered in blood, Jenna and Sarah collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, their bodies racked with sobs. But as the morning light washed over them, a heavy silence settled. The forest, once filled with terror and dread, seemed almost peaceful now, as if purged of the darkness that had haunted it for so long. They had escaped, but they knew they would never truly be free from the horrors of that night. Weeks later, Jenna sat alone in her apartment, the weight of their encounter still fresh in her mind. She had lost touch with Sarah, each of them going their separate ways to deal with their trauma alone. But every night, she felt his presence, lurking in the shadows. A silent reminder of her sins. One evening, as she checked her mailbox, she found a letter without a return address. Her hands shook as she opened it, her breath catching as she read the simple, handwritten message inside. "Some things never die, Jenna. Neither do nightmares." And as she looked up, she swore she saw his scarred face reflected in the glass of her front door, watching, waiting.